June 22, 1941. Along the quiet edges of the Soviet border, the night is beginning to fade. A pale blue light spreads over the vast fields of Eastern Europe, revealing endless rows of German armor-cold steel lined like a knife pressed against the horizon. Engines hum beneath tarps. Tank crews whisper final checks. Officers stare at their watches, listening to the steady ticking that counts down to an irreversible moment. Inside the forward command post at Führer headquarters in East Prussia, Adolf Hitler stands motionless over a map that stretches across an entire table. His hands rest behind his back, his gaze locked on the thin red line marking the Soviet frontier. For months he has been convinced this is the move that will reshape the world. A single order will now send 3 million soldiers into a land he believes will collapse with one decisive blow. At 3:15. The code word goes out. The horizon erupts in fire, asterisk, and with that ignition of guns and engines. Hitler commits the mistake that will eventually cost him Europe, a mistake rooted in ambition far greater than the reality before him. The consequences begin to unfold immediately. Flowing into the deeper context of how this decision was made, asterisk, in the summer of 1940, Europe lay in a state of shock. Within a single year, Adolf Hitler had overturned the strategic balance of the continent. Poland had fallen in weeks. Norway and Denmark collapsed with stunning speed. The Low Countries, Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands crumbled under the weight of German maneuver warfare. And the greatest defeat of all came with the fall of France, a nation believed to possess one of the strongest armies in the world. It took Germany just 6 weeks to end a military tradition centuries old. Across the English Channel, Britain stood isolated. Its cities were under bombardment, its army recovering from the evacuation at Dunkirk, its future uncertain. To the outside observer, it appeared as though nothing could slow the German advance. The Wehrmacht moved with an efficiency and precision that gave the impression of an unstoppable machine. After 2 decades of humiliation following the First World War, Germany had reasserted itself as a dominant power. Hitler believed this momentum was the product not only of military strength, but also of destiny. His ambitions had been growing for years, and they pointed inexorably toward the east. The temporary cooperation with the Soviet Union sealed in the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 1939 was, in his mind, a convenience rather than a commitment. While the pact provided Germany with crucial resources such as oil, grain, and raw materials, Hitler never saw the Soviet Union as an ally. He viewed it as an ideological enemy and a future battleground. Behind his public statements and diplomatic engagements, Hitler saw the Soviet Union as the ultimate space for Lebensraum, the expansion of German living territory. The destruction of what he called Jewish Bolshevism was central to his worldview. Yet despite the ideological fervor, many within the German high command urged caution. They understood the vastness of the Soviet Union, the depth of its manpower reserves, and the challenges of sustaining a prolonged campaign over thousands of kilometers. But the triumphs of 1940 had reshaped Hitler's confidence into something far more rigid. His generals warned him that invading Britain should remain the priority. Others suggested consolidating gains in Western Europe or securing the Mediterranean through campaigns in North Africa and the Middle East. But Hitler saw these as distractions. The war against the Soviet Union seemed to him not only necessary but inevitable. Throughout early 1941, strategic debates intensified within the German command structure. While some officers pressed for a continued focus on Britain, Hitler dismissed the idea. To him, Britain was already defeated in spirit. Its survival depended on the hope of Soviet or American intervention. Remove the Soviet Union, he argued, and Britain would lose its last potential continental ally. At the same time, a series of miscalculations began shaping German expectations. Intelligence estimates dramatically underestimated the size of the Red Army. German analysts believed the Soviets had roughly half the tanks and aircraft they actually possessed. Reports also claimed the USSR was on the brink of collapse, shaken by purges and internal disorganization. These errors reinforced Hitler's belief that a swift offensive could topple the Soviet state in a matter of months. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, though still in effect, began showing signs of strain. Soviet territorial ambitions in the Balkans and Baltic region clashed with German interests. Hitler interpreted these moves as evidence of Stalin's long-term hostility, convincing him that preemptive action was not only justified but strategic. The decision hardened in his mind: the war against the East must come before any final settlement with the West. By early spring, preparations for the invasion were underway. The largest concentration of German forces in history assembled along the Soviet frontier. Supply lines were extended. Roads were reinforced. Airfields were constructed covertly. The Wehrmacht, confident in its victories, prepared for what many believed would be another swift campaign. And yet beneath the surface, uncertainties simmered. The distances were enormous. The logistical demands were unlike anything Germany had ever attempted. But Hitler believed the momentum of the previous year provided its own kind of clarity. The stage was set for a decision that would reshape the war, and as these preparations deepened, a second layer of context reveals why the invasion was far more dangerous for Germany than it first appeared. As German forces gathered along the Soviet frontier in early 1941, the scale of what they were preparing to undertake remained unmatched in modern military history. Yet beneath the confidence projected by Hitler and the propaganda machine, the foundations of Operation Barbarossa were unstable. In many ways, Germany was preparing for a war it was not built to fight. The Wehrmacht's early victories had created a dangerous illusion. Blitzkrieg had succeeded in Poland and Western Europe not simply because of German innovation, but also because of geographical conditions, limited depth, and opponents who were either strategically unprepared or constrained by rigid doctrine. The Soviet Union presented a fundamentally different challenge, one defined by vast distances, harsh seasons, and a capacity for industrial regeneration unmatched anywhere in Europe. German planners severely underestimated the scale of Soviet resources. Intelligence reports suggested the Red Army possessed around 10,000 tanks. In reality, the number was far higher. Among them was the T-34, a tank with sloped armor and wide tracks that would overshadow anything the Germans fielded in the opening months. Soviet aircraft production, thought to be slow and inefficient, was accelerating at an industrial pace. And even after devastating purges of its officer corps, the Soviet Union retained a deep reservoir of manpower and leadership potential. Germany's own industrial capacity presented another obstacle. The nation had not fully mobilized for long-term war. Its armaments production, though impressive in quality, lacked the volume and sustainability required for a multi-front conflict. The economy relied heavily on imported oil, grain, and metals, many of which came from the Soviet Union under the very pact Hitler intended to break. Without Soviet raw materials, Germany would need to secure its own industrial lifeline on conquered territory. Adding further pressure on the war's timetable, the entire premise of Barbarossa depended on speed. German planners envisioned a campaign lasting no more than 5 months. They believed the Soviet Union would collapse before winter. This assumption shaped every logistical decision. Supply lines were not designed for distances beyond the Dnieper River. Railway gauges were incompatible. Fuel stockpiles were insufficient. Motorized divisions were expected to outrun their own supply networks. Hitler's ideology compounded these errors. He believed the Slavic population would not resist with determination, and that the Soviet system was so politically brittle it would collapse under the first wave of assault. He ignored intelligence reports warning of deep Soviet reserves east of the Urals, and dismissed concerns that the Red Army would recover after initial losses. In his mind, willpower and racial conviction outweighed material and strategic reality. On the Soviet side, a complex and contradictory situation was unfolding. Despite receiving multiple intelligence warnings about an imminent invasion from British, American, and even German sources, Stalin refused to believe Germany would break the pact. He suspected the reports were attempts by Britain to provoke war between the two powers. Orders were issued to avoid provoking German forces. Soviet divisions remained spread thin, many unprepared for rapid mobilization. This paralysis contributed to the catastrophic losses of June 1941, but it also masked the depth of Soviet resilience. The Soviet Union possessed strategic depth unmatched in Europe. Its factories, many located in western regions, could be relocated across the Ural Mountains. Its population could be mobilized in the millions. Its commanders, despite early purges, adapted quickly under extreme pressure taught to German soldiers preparing for the invasion. These realities remained hidden. From their vantage point, the Soviet frontier appeared quiet and fragile. But the silence masked a sleeping giant, one that Germany neither fully understood nor properly accounted for. And as the sun rose on June 22nd, the Wehrmacht stepped into a campaign built on miscalculations that would grow heavier with every mile pushed eastward. Those miscalculations, however, can only be fully understood by examining the deeper angles: human, strategic, technological, and ideological, that shaped both the decision and its consequences. Asterisk. At the center of Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union was an ideology that left little room for strategic caution. His worldview framed the conflict not merely as a military campaign, but as a civilizational struggle. To him, the war in the East was a necessary confrontation with what he regarded as racial and political enemies. This lens distorted his assessments and those of the people around him. Where his generals saw terrain, manpower, and logistical realities, Hitler saw ideological destiny. He believed the Slavic population would crumble, that the political structure of the Soviet Union was inherently weak, and that Bolshevism was a hollow construct held together only by fear. This conviction was not supported by military intelligence, but it shaped the operational planning of Barbarossa. Hitler's confidence in an inevitable Soviet collapse meant that long-term supply planning, winter preparations, and reserve contingencies were not treated as priorities. As the campaign progressed, this ideological blindness prevented him from adapting. Even as German troops captured hundreds of thousands of prisoners, the Red Army continued to assemble new formations. Hitler dismissed this resilience as temporary and insisted that victory was still imminent, reinforcing a cycle in which belief overshadowed evidence. The invasion of the Soviet Union became not a calculated military decision, but an expression of ideological extremism overpowering strategic logic. This rigid worldview contributed to another critical factor: an inflated sense of tactical superiority that shaped the early months of the campaign. Asterisk. The successes of 1939 and 1940 had created within the German high command a deep trust in blitzkrieg doctrine. The combination of armored thrusts, close air support, and rapid mechanized maneuver had proven devastating against European powers. France's collapse had become a symbol of German tactical prowess. Confidence hardened into expectation. Blitzkrieg would work everywhere, against any opponent. This assumption shaped the structure of Barbarossa. German commanders planned 3 massive army groups to drive deep into Soviet territory, encircle vast Soviet formations, and break the Red Army within weeks. The possibility that the Soviets could absorb these blows, reorganize, and counterattack was barely considered. When warnings emerged that Soviet divisions were appearing in unexpected strength, they were often dismissed as miscalculations or anomalies. The belief in German tactical superiority also influenced the decision to divide objectives. Hitler's interference redirecting armored units away from Moscow toward Ukraine and Leningrad was partly fueled by his conviction that the Red Army was already beaten. He assumed German forces had the operational freedom to pursue multiple goals simultaneously. In reality, this dispersal of effort allowed the Soviets to stabilize fronts, rebuild defenses, and prepare the counteroffensives that would slow the Wehrmacht. Later in the year, the arrogance of assuming victory as inevitable created blind spots that widened with every kilometer gained. German units found themselves stretched thin across frontages far larger than they were designed to hold. Supply columns struggled across dirt roads that turned to mud under summer storms. Aircraft suffered increased wear from extended operations. And still, the expectation persisted that the war was nearing its conclusion. But beneath these operational challenges lay a deeper misjudgment, the resilience and determination of the people the invasion sought to defeat. One of the most significant miscalculations of Barbarossa was the German assumption that Soviet morale would collapse under pressure. Hitler believed the population, oppressed by Stalin's regime, would welcome German forces or at least refuse to support the Soviet war effort. Early German propaganda reinforced this belief, portraying the Soviet Union as a fractured society held together only by fear. The reality was far different. Although the Soviet state had suffered from internal repression, famine, and political purges, the invasion created a unifying shock. Millions of civilians mobilized to support the war effort. Workers shifted into emergency production around the clock. Factories began dismantling heavy machinery to send east. Railway lines clogged with trains carrying industrial equipment across thousands of kilometers. This national effort, driven by a mix of fear, patriotism, and survival, allowed the Soviet Union to regenerate military power at a speed that stunned German observers. On the battlefield, the human factor was even more visible. Soviet soldiers, many poorly equipped and hastily trained, fought with tenacity that contradicted German expectations. Entire divisions were encircled, yet resistance continued. New formations appeared seemingly out of nowhere. Commanders who survived the initial shock adapted quickly, learning from mistakes and reorganizing defenses under immense pressure. As the Germans advanced deeper, they discovered that the Soviet Union was not a fragile state waiting to collapse. It was a nation capable of absorbing unimaginable losses while still producing new armies. The human spirit behind the Soviet war effort, reinforced by fear of occupation and determination to defend homeland, became a decisive factor in slowing the German advance. These three angles: ideology, tactical arrogance, and misjudgment of human resilience, formed the core of Hitler's monumental strategic error. But deeper structural forces were also at play, which emerge clearly when examining the economic, logistical, and geopolitical layers of the decision. While ideology and tactical confidence shaped the emotional framework of Operation Barbarossa, the economic foundation beneath Germany's war machine was far more fragile. Even at the height of its victories, Germany faced chronic shortages. The nation lacked sufficient domestic oil, rubber, and key industrial metals. Much of its armored and mechanized capability depended on fuel imports, ironically, many of which came from the Soviet Union before the invasion. By turning east, Hitler severed a critical supply lifeline. The expectation was that the Soviet oil fields in the Caucasus would fall quickly, providing Germany with long-term strategic independence. But these fields lay hundreds of kilometers beyond the initial objectives of Barbarossa. The Wehrmacht would have to fight through vast territory, resist counterattacks, and maintain stretched supply routes just to reach them. Even then, capturing oil infrastructure intact was far from guaranteed. Without secure fuel reserves, every German operation became a gamble. Panzer divisions advancing into Soviet territory often found themselves slowing not due to resistance, but because supply convoys lagged behind. Fuel consumption on the Eastern Front was far higher than planners anticipated. Harsh terrain, poor roads, and long distances turned mechanized warfare into a logistical struggle. As the campaign dragged into autumn, shortages became more pronounced. Tanks that had spearheaded the summer offensives were immobilized for lack of fuel. Aircraft sorties decreased. Trucks broke down under strain, reducing the mobility of entire divisions. Instead of replenishing these losses, Germany was forced to ration fuel, even for critical operations. This problem only intensified in later years, undermining every major offensive from Stalingrad to Kursk. Germany's belief that the war would be short meant it never prepared for sustained economic pressure. By launching Barbarossa without securing long-term resources, Hitler committed his forces to a campaign with diminishing returns, one in which every mile east increased the strain on the very fuel that powered the German war machine. This dependence on speed and surprise fed directly into another structural flaw: the strategic catastrophe of opening a two-front war. For more than a century, German military doctrine had warned against fighting a war on two fronts. Both Bismarck and the General Staff had crafted diplomacy and strategy around avoiding such a scenario. Yet by June 1941, Hitler willingly forced Germany into the exact situation earlier generations had feared. Though weakened, it was still resisting, supported by its navy, empire, and growing American assistance. Germany's failure to force Britain into surrender during the Battle of Britain meant the Western Front, though quiet, was still active. German cities were vulnerable to air raids. The Atlantic supply routes were contested. The possibility of Allied landings in Europe remained a constant shadow. By invading the Soviet Union before neutralizing Britain, Germany created a strategic imbalance from which it could not recover. The Wehrmacht now had to divide resources between holding Western Europe, fighting in North Africa, and sustaining a massive offensive in the East. Meanwhile, Britain gained time to gather strength, time to integrate American industry, and time to prepare for a return to the continent. The United States, though not yet officially at war in June 1941, had already begun supplying Britain with food, vehicles, and aircraft through Lend-Lease. When Germany launched Barbarossa, the U.S. saw even more reason to support the Allies, viewing the conflict as a battle between democratic and totalitarian worlds. Hitler had hoped the invasion of the Soviet Union would intimidate the West. Instead, it convinced them that Germany's ambitions threatened the entire global balance. The two-front dilemma stretched German capabilities beyond sustainable limits. Troops were tied down across thousands of kilometers. Supplies had to be prioritized, often at the expense of critical sectors. Reinforcements sent to one front weakened another. The Wehrmacht no longer enjoyed concentration of force, the key principle behind its early victories. Instead, Germany found itself reacting to crises in multiple theaters, unable to stabilize its strategic position. This overstretch exposed an even deeper problem. Germany lacked a coherent, unified objective for the Eastern Campaign. Competing priorities fractured the war effort before it had fully begun. Perhaps the most overlooked yet decisive aspect of Hitler's mistake was the absence of clear strategic objectives. At the outset of Barbarossa, the German leadership lacked consensus on what the primary goals should be. Each branch of the military envisioned a different outcome, and Hitler's own views shifted throughout the early months. For the Army General Staff, the capture of Moscow was paramount. They viewed the Soviet capital as the center of political authority, rail networks, and administrative organization. Taking Moscow, they argued, would cause the Soviet system to collapse, disorganizing military command and disrupting the economy. Hitler, however, prioritized economic regions. He believed the agricultural richness of Ukraine and the industrial centers of the Donbass region were the keys to crippling Soviet capacity. His priority was the destruction of the Red Army in the field, not the capture of cities. This led him to redirect crucial armored units away from the central axis, slowing the drive toward Moscow. Meanwhile, other advisors argued for eliminating Leningrad to secure the northern flank or pushing toward the Caucasus to seize oil fields. The result was an operation without a singular strategic focus. German forces advanced on broad, dispersed fronts, achieving tactical successes but failing to deliver a decisive, strategic blow. This fragmentation allowed the Soviet Union to delay, reorganize, and rebuild. Every diverging objective created time that the Red Army desperately needed, and Germany could not afford to give these structural, economic, and logistical angles, combined with ideological and tactical errors, formed the full picture of Hitler's catastrophic miscalculation. And as autumn approached, these compounding flaws began to collide with the brutal realities of the Eastern Front. The turning point was coming, first slowly, then suddenly. In the opening weeks of Operation Barbarossa, the Wehrmacht unleashed a storm unlike anything the world had seen. Armored spearheads cut deep into Soviet territory. Entire Red Army formations were encircled in vast pockets. Minsk, Białystok, Smolensk, where hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were captured in a matter of days. Luftwaffe strikes smashed airfields and destroyed thousands of aircraft on the ground. German officers believed the campaign was unfolding exactly as planned, yet beneath the spectacle of rapid victories, small but significant signs of strain began to appear. The first cracks emerged in logistics. Germany's mechanized forces outran their supply lines almost immediately. Trucks struggled across poor Soviet roads, and railways had to be converted from the Soviet broad gauge to the European standard, a slow, labor-intensive process. Fuel and ammunition convoys fell behind. Panzer divisions that should have been driving forward at maximum speed were forced to halt while supplies caught up. Then came the strategic divergence at the highest level. As Army Group Center pushed toward Moscow in July, Hitler ordered its panzer groups to turn south toward Ukraine, believing economic targets were more important than seizing the Soviet capital. The generals protested, arguing that halting the central drive would give the Red Army time to regroup. But Hitler, convinced that multiple objectives could be pursued simultaneously, insisted on the diversion. The decision cost Germany critical weeks. The redirection of armor delayed the advance on Moscow until autumn, when the weather began to shift. Meanwhile, Soviet forces used the reprieve to reorganize, fortify defensive lines, and deploy newly raised divisions from deeper within the country. Despite these delays, German forces still achieved massive territorial gains through the summer. Kiev fell in September after one of the largest encirclements in military history, with nearly 600,000 Soviet soldiers captured. But every victory carried a hidden cost. Casualties accumulated. Vehicles wore down. Supply strain increased with every kilometer eastward. Then the weather changed. In early October, the skies opened. Rainfall transformed dirt roads into thick sludge. The infamous Rasputitsa, the season of mud, brought the Wehrmacht's mobility to a halt. Tanks bogged down axle-deep. Horses collapsed pulling wagons through sticky fields. Fuel trucks struggled to reach the front lines. Units that had advanced swiftly across Europe now found themselves fighting the landscape itself. When the mud finally froze, it brought no relief. Instead of fluid maneuver warfare, the Germans faced the onset of winter, one of the coldest in decades. Temperatures plunged to 20 degrees Celsius, then 30 degrees Celsius, and eventually to 40 degrees Celsius. Engines failed to start. Oil thickened. Weapons jammed. Soldiers wrapped themselves in whatever cloth they could find, scarves, blankets, captured Soviet coats. The Wehrmacht, designed for short, decisive campaigns, had not been issued winter gear. Hitler had not believed it would be needed. The advance toward Moscow slowed to a crawl, but continued with grim determination. By November, German forces approached the outskirts of the capital. They could see the glow of the city on the horizon. Some forward units reported spotting church spires through their field glasses. The psychological pull of Moscow was immense. Its capture symbolized victory, but every step forward was harder than the last. Soviet resistance stiffened. Fresh reinforcements arrived from Siberia, battle-hardened, well-equipped, and accustomed to winter warfare. For the first time, German troops encountered units capable of matching their training and discipline. The lack of winter clothing compounded their suffering. Frostbite spread through the ranks. Rifle bolts snapped in the cold. Vehicles stalled until fires could warm their engines. By early December, the German advance had stalled completely. The Wehrmacht was exhausted, depleted, and unprepared for prolonged combat in winter conditions. The momentum, the foundation of blitzkrieg, had evaporated. And at the very moment the German front line reached its limits, the Soviets were preparing the counterstrike that would shift the balance of the war. The turning point was now at hand, arriving not in a single moment, but through a wave of coordinated blows that would shatter the illusion of German invincibility. On December 5, 1941. As temperatures plunged below 30 degrees Celsius, the Red Army struck back. What began along a broad arc outside Moscow soon expanded into the first major Soviet counteroffensive of the war. This was not merely a local push. It was a coordinated surge involving newly formed armies, fresh divisions from Siberia, and commanders who had learned hard lessons from the disasters of the summer. As German soldiers huddled in makeshift shelters, struggling to keep their rifles functioning in the freezing air, Soviet infantry launched assault after assault along the frozen front. Artillery batteries, their barrels rapped against the cold, hammered German positions with relentless fire. Ski battalions cut through forests and struck at exposed flanks. The T-34, its wide tracks, perfectly suited for snow, advanced where German vehicles bogged down or refused to start. The Germans were stunned. Until this moment, they believed the Soviet Union was on the verge of collapse. Their intelligence had missed the buildup of reserves east of the Ural Mountains. They had not expected entire formations of experienced Siberian troops, equipped with white camouflage and trained for winter warfare. These men had been freed from the Far East after Stalin received assurances that Japan would not attack. Their arrival shifted the balance at a critical moment. German defensive lines, already strained by exhaustion and cold, began to buckle. Some units were pushed back several kilometers in a single night. Others broke entirely, retreating in disorganized groups across the snow-covered fields. Commanders struggled to maintain cohesion. Horses essential to German logistics died by the thousands, depriving units of mobility and supply transport. Frostbite casualties soared, in some divisions outnumbering combat wounds. Desperation spread through the ranks. Reports from the front described rifles frozen to soldiers' hands, tank engines that shattered when crews tried to start them, and entire battalions reduced to half their strength from exposure alone. The once confident Wehrmacht found itself fighting not just the Red Army, but also the merciless Russian winter, a force for which it had never prepared. As the situation deteriorated, Hitler made a decision that would deepen the crisis. He personally assumed direct command of the German army, removing experienced generals from operational authority. He forbade any strategic withdrawal, insisting that every position be held at all costs. He believed retreat would mirror the collapse of 1918 and refused to repeat what he saw as the failures of the past. This order, driven by fear rather than strategy, forced German units to remain in exposed positions far longer than was tactically sound. Entire divisions were nearly annihilated as they tried to hold lines that were no longer defensible. Commanders in the field, stripped of authority to maneuver, watched their forces dwindle under relentless Soviet pressure. For the German soldier, the psychological shift was unmistakable. The myth of invincibility so carefully built through the victories of 1939 and 1940 shattered in the snow outside Moscow. Veterans who had marched triumphantly into Paris now found themselves retreating through frozen forests, pursued by an enemy they had been told would break easily. Instead, the Red Army fought with increasing organization, determination, and confidence. For the Soviets, the counteroffensive marked a turning point in morale. The capital had been saved. German forces were pushed back between 100 and 250 kilometers from their closest approach. The immediate threat to Moscow passed, and with it, the belief within the Soviet hierarchy that defeat was imminent. Stalin seized the moment to rally the nation, portraying the defense of Moscow as evidence that the Red Army could not only resist, but also drive the invader back. Strategically, the consequences were profound. Barbarossa's fundamental objective, the destruction of the Soviet Union in a single campaign, was now impossible. The failure to take Moscow symbolized a deeper failure. Germany had not broken Soviet command, industry, or morale. Instead, the USSR entered 1942 with renewed resolve. Vast reserves and an industrial system expanding far beyond German capacity. The Germans had been forced from the offensive to the defensive for the first time. Their forces were depleted, winter-stricken, and stretched thin across a front that now extended thousands of kilometers. They had taken enormous losses in men and material losses they could not replace as quickly as their enemy. Meanwhile, Soviet industry, relocated east of the Urals, was ramping up production to levels that would surpass German output within months. This shift in momentum was not merely a battlefield reversal. It was the moment when Hitler's gamble in the East transformed from ambition into catastrophe. The campaign designed to end the war had instead ensured that Germany would face a prolonged conflict it could neither control nor afford. And from this turning point, the consequences began to unfold rapidly, reshaping the entire trajectory of the Second World War. The failure before Moscow in the winter of 1941–42 marked not just a tactical setback for Germany, but a profound strategic defeat. In the months that followed, the true cost of Hitler's decision began to emerge. What had been envisioned as a swift and decisive campaign turned into a prolonged struggle of attrition, one that the German state was never equipped to sustain. The Eastern Front now demanded enormous resources. Millions of German soldiers were tied down across a line stretching from the Arctic Circle to the Black Sea. Every division that held the front required food, ammunition, fuel, winter clothing, medical supplies, and continuous reinforcement. Instead of preparing for new offensives in Western Europe or the Mediterranean, Germany found itself committing the bulk of its strength to merely hold the ground gained during the summer of 1941. The attrition was staggering. By early 1942, the Wehrmacht had lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers killed, wounded, or missing. Thousands of tanks and vehicles were destroyed or disabled. Horse transport, the backbone of German logistics, had been devastated by the cold. Aircraft losses, though less dramatic, strained Luftwaffe capabilities at a critical time. These losses could not be easily replaced. German industry, still not fully mobilized for total war, operated at levels insufficient for a conflict of this scale. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union adapted with remarkable speed. Entire industrial sectors were moved eastward over the Urals and into Siberia, far beyond the reach of German bombers. Within months, these relocated factories were producing tanks, aircraft, and artillery at a rate that astonished Allied observers. While Germany struggled to maintain its offensive capability, Soviet production increased year after year, eventually surpassing the combined output of all Axis nations. The psychological shift was equally significant. The winter victory outside Moscow dispelled the aura of German invincibility. For the first time, the Allies saw that the Wehrmacht could be stopped. Stalin capitalized on this momentum, strengthening morale and reinforcing The narrative that the Soviet Union would ultimately triumph through endurance and sacrifice, international dynamics also shifted. The United States, already providing support to Britain through Lend-Lease, intensified its commitment after Germany declared war in December 1941. American industrial power began to flow into British and later Soviet hands trucks, aircraft, locomotives, food, and fuel. Hitler's failure in Russia had expanded the war into a global conflict with an industrial adversary far beyond Germany's capacity to match. The strain of the Eastern Front also undermined Germany's alliances. Romania and Hungary, bound to Germany by territorial promises and fear of Soviet power, suffered heavy losses supporting Barbarossa. Their enthusiasm waned as the campaigns dragged on without decisive victory. Italy struggled in North Africa and relied increasingly on German intervention. The unity of the Axis weakened as Germany's ability to support its partners diminished. Militarily, the consequences were immediate and far-reaching. The failure to destroy the Soviet Union in 1941 ensured that the Wehrmacht would face years of brutal fighting across terrain that offered little advantage. The new phase of the war was defined not by swift maneuvers, but by grinding battles of attrition. The 1942 offensive toward the Caucasus and Stalingrad was born from desperation, an attempt to seize the oil and industrial resources that Barbarossa had failed to secure. But these operations carried enormous risk and stretched German forces even further. The summer advances of 1942 gave the illusion of renewed momentum, yet they masked a deeper instability. German divisions were under strength, supply lines were overextended, and the Red Army was rapidly rebuilding its operational capacity. By winter, the strategic overreach culminated in the encirclement at Stalingrad, disaster directly linked to the failure of the 1941 campaign. Each setback traced back to the same core decision: the invasion of the Soviet Union under conditions that made long-term success impossible. And as 1942 unfolded, the weight of that mistake began to pull Germany closer to a crisis from which it would never recover. By the end of 1942, the consequences of Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union were no longer theoretical. They were playing out on every front, shaping the fate of Europe in ways that could not be reversed. What began as a confident strike intended to secure Germany's dominance instead created the very circumstances that ensured its downfall. The Eastern Front consumed the German war machine. Nearly 3/4 of all German casualties occurred there. Divisions that once spearheaded rapid victories in the West were slowly eroded in battles that yielded little strategic gain. Every time a new offensive was launched toward Moscow in 1941, into the Caucasus in 1942, at Kursk in 1943, Germany committed resources it could not replace. The Soviet Union, by contrast, grew stronger as the war continued. Its factories produced tanks, artillery, and aircraft in staggering numbers, while its population, mobilized on a scale unmatched in Europe, filled the ranks of new armies year after year. Germany had entered the war with a finite pool of skilled manpower. Barbarossa drained that pool at an unsustainable rate. The destruction of experienced units meant that replacements, often younger, less trained soldiers, were sent into critical battles. The qualitative advantage that had once defined the Wehrmacht steadily eroded. Meanwhile, Soviet training improved, officer corps stabilized, and battlefield coordination became increasingly sophisticated. Economically, the invasion created a spiral of scarcity. Germany was forced to divert vast quantities of fuel, ammunition, and industrial output towards simply holding its positions in the East. This left fewer resources for the defense of Western Europe, the Mediterranean, and North Africa. By 1943, the Luftwaffe, already strained by losses over Russia, could no longer maintain air superiority against Allied bombers. German cities were devastated by strategic bombing campaigns. Factories struggled to keep pace. Transport networks were disrupted. The war effort faced pressure from all directions. This massive commitment to the East had a transformative effect on the broader war. With the bulk of German forces locked in a struggle against the Soviet Union, the Western Allies gained time to rebuild their strength. Britain's survival became assured. The United States, now fully engaged, mobilized its industrial power on a scale unprecedented in modern history. American factories produced aircraft, tanks, trucks, ships, and munitions at rates dwarfing those of the Axis. These resources flowed into Britain and the Soviet Union, building the foundation for a coordinated Allied strategy. By the time Germany attempted its last major eastern offensive at Kursk in July 1943, its fate was sealed. The offensive failed, marking the end of German strategic initiative. From that moment onward, Hitler faced a relentless sequence of blows: the Soviet advance in the east, the Allied landings in Italy, the intensifying bombing of German cities, and finally the invasion of France in June 1944. D-Day was possible because Barbarossa had drained Germany's capacity to defend a second front. With most of its strength tied down fighting the Red Army, Germany could not prevent a massive amphibious landing in Western Europe. As Soviet forces advanced westward in overwhelming numbers, the political map of Europe shifted dramatically. Nations once under German occupation began to fall. The Wehrmacht retreated from territory it had conquered at enormous cost. Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Finland reassessed their alliances as Soviet armies approached their borders. Germany's coalition fractured. Its diplomatic influence collapsed. By early 1945, Soviet troops stood at the gates of Berlin. The war Hitler had launched to secure German dominance ended with the destruction of his capital, the fragmentation of his armed forces, and the devastation of the very Europe he sought to control. The Third Reich fell in ruins because its leader had underestimated the power, resilience, and resources of the enemy he chose to fight. Operation Barbarossa was not merely a military campaign gone wrong. It was the hinge on which the entire war turned. Hitler's decision to invade the Soviet Union, under flawed assumptions and without adequate preparation, set Germany on an irreversible path to defeat. It drained its manpower, shattered its economy, fractured its alliances, and enabled its enemies to unite with overwhelming force. From this single strategic miscalculation came the collapse of Germany's ambitions, the shift of global power, and the reshaping of Europe itself. And in the quiet after the guns finally fell silent, the true magnitude of that mistake became undeniable. In the long arc of history, certain decisions stand out not for their ambition, but for the consequences they unleash. Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union was one of those decisions, a moment when confidence eclipsed caution, when ideology overshadowed strategy, and when the pursuit of dominance blinded a leader to the limits of his own power. It was a choice born from certainty, yet it produced an outcome defined by loss, exhaustion, and the slow erosion of a war machine that once seemed unstoppable. The vast expanses of the Eastern Front became a reminder that not all victories can be forced by speed or will alone. Nature, distance, and human resilience played their roles with quiet but unrelenting force. The men who fought in the fields, forests, and frozen plains carried the weight of decisions made far from the front, enduring hardships that revealed both the capacity for endurance and the cost of misjudged ambition. For Europe, the consequences were profound. The war's direction shifted, alliances hardened, and the tides of power moved inexorably toward those who could sustain the pressures of a prolonged conflict. Barbarossa did not merely fail, it redefined the trajectory of the entire war, shaping borders, societies, and political realities for generations to come. Looking back, the lesson remains unmistakable. When strategy bends to ideology, when leaders overlook complexity in favor of certainty, and when ambition outpaces preparation, the cost can be catastrophic. The decision Hitler believed would secure his vision for Europe instead ensured its collapse. In the end, the greatest mistake was not the invasion itself, but the belief that the world would bend to a single will without resistance. Adaptation or consequence. And so the story of Barbarossa endures, not only as a military failure but as a reminder of the dangers that arise when power is guided by conviction, untempered by realism and echo. From history that still speaks with quiet clarity.